I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all here for our afternoon keynotes. We're delighted to welcome Jane Seale from the Open University, who is Professor of Education in the Faculty of Wellness, Education and Language Studies in the UK. Jane's teaching and research interests lie at the intersections between disability, technology and inclusion. Her work focuses in particular on the role that technologies play in the lives of people with learning disabilities or intellectual impairments, and the factors that influence or sustain the digital exclusion of disabled learners. Jane's methodological interest is the development and evaluation of participatory research methods that promote voice and empowerment for disabled research participants and partners. Jane has recently completed a research study entitled Accessible Resources for Cultural Heritage Ecosystems, which uses participatory methods to engage people with sensory and intellectual impairments in working with technology companies to design and evaluate technologies that facilitate access to museums. Jane has drawn on her experiences to edit a recent book, A Research Agenda for Technology and Disability, which was published by Edward Elgar Publishing very recently. I do recommend it if you can get a copy. I'm just going to share your slides, Jane, and then I'd like to invite you to present.
Thank you, Sarah. And apologies for giving you such a long bio to speak out. You did very well. I should have made it more accessible, shouldn't I? So thank you. Yes, I'm going to be sharing with you this afternoon, colleagues, my ideas about how we can apply critical pedagogy to the teaching of accessibility. And I'm going to be focusing particularly on methods for involving disabled people in technology design. So Sarah can move me on to the next slide. I just wanted to help you get an overview of how I'm structuring this. It's in 3 parts. There'll be a brief introduction to the context. I'll then move on and talk briefly around ableism and how we perpetuate ableism through our pedagogy. And the biggest part of my talk will be how do we tackle ableism, and I'll be sharing my thoughts with you around that in relation to teaching accessibility. So if Sarah could move us on, context, that's just it, and then the next one. So I just wanted you to be aware of what my focus and my influences are. So broad focus, when I'm talking about accessibility, I'm talking about any particular kind of technology, not a specific one. Websites, everyday technologies, assistive technologies, anything goes. My specific focus in terms of curriculum or what can be taught and how we teach it is on methods for promoting the involvement of disabled people in the design of new technologies. And as you probably guessed from my bio that Sarah kindly read out, I'm going to be drawing on my experience of participatory research with adults with learning disabilities, but also participatory design of new technologies. And I have an experience of working with adults with learning disabilities as well as those with sensory impairments. And you'll also guess through my talk that I'm influenced by 2 kind of fields of study, if you like. I'm influenced by critical pedagogy, but also you might spot some critical disability studies influence in there as well. So that's my positioning and that's where I'm coming from. So if we move on to the next slide, just want to talk briefly around ableism and how we might perpetuate it. So if we go on to the next slide, Sarah. Essentially, I think all of us will be aware that ableism is when we devalue, discriminate against people with disabilities. But I want to pick out 2 particular aspects of ableism that I think are really relevant when thinking about how we teach accessibility in relation to technology. One aspect of ableism, I would argue, is when we consciously or unconsciously assume various things. We assume that people with disabilities need or want to be fixed in some way, that they can't live with their disability and they are seeking for a cure or a fix. That technology is that fix that disabled people are searching for. But thirdly, that non-disabled people are the best or the only people to design these fix or cures through technology. And the second key aspect of ableism that I'll be talking about is excluding people with disabilities from design conversation, design spaces, design decisions, the whole kit and caboodle, if you like. So if that's what ableism is, if we move to the next slide, how do we express that through our pedagogy? Essentially, my starting point, my argument is that we thank you. Don't panic me, Sarah. We express ableism in our pedagogy by transmitting valued knowledge that when we're teaching students, we transmit to them what we think is valued knowledge, and we need to be careful. We're at risk of transmitting knowledge that doesn't challenge ableism, but instead perpetuates it, perpetuates the status quo where the power imbalances in design relationships remain. And that's really what I want to talk through with you this afternoon in the rest of my talk. So if we move on, Sarah. Just wanted to give you a couple of examples of ableism in the context of accessibility and design. First one is where we allow students to present or engage in design projects where the technology that's being designed is positioned as a cure. Technology-focused projects, as I would call them, that start with the technology, they start with the cure, and we will see it all the times in the places that we occupy as academics, where somebody has said, oh, look, there's a brand new piece of technology, and they start there and say, let's find a disability problem that technology can fix. And I would suggest that that's ableist. But I think there are also nuanced examples of ableism. So I've put one here on the slide that I feel very passionate about, actually, where I would argue that a lot of design projects that I've come across focus on those disabilities that are the least stigmatized or the most popular, the most understood, the most media friendly. And the typical ones that I'm aware of are Asperger's syndrome or autism. They get written about a lot as or picked on a lot, if you like, as this tokenistic way of, okay, we're going to do disability, let's do Asperger's. And similarly with visual impairment, often when we talk to people about accessibility, the only group that they can think about or appear willing to think about is, oh, we need to make it accessible for people with visual impairment, as if that's enough. And I would suggest that's ableist in itself in a way, or certainly not challenging the power imbalances. So let's move on to the next slide then. A second example, again, I feel very passionate about, that I would suggest is ableist, but also not really challenging power imbalances more broadly, is often what I see in projects, research projects, funded or unfunded, for disabled people, is the idea that we will only design technologies, we can only justify designing technologies if we say using those technologies will improve the educational, health or vocational outcomes for disabled people, as if they were the only valued outcomes, and particularly as if disabled people don't have other outcomes that they might also value, such as leisure, friendship, intimate relationships. Heaven forbid disabled people might have sex or want sex, for example. And what I'm trying to say here is that often, in order to get funding, we can be drawn into a kind of neoliberal view of disability, that we need to use technology to fix disabled people so that they are productive, economically independent members of society. And obviously leisure, friendship and those kind of things doesn't feed into that narrative. And that's why I'm raising it here. So if we move on to the next slide, how do we tackle ableism in relation to teaching accessibility? I want to briefly introduce you in the next slide, Sarah, to critical pedagogy. It's a seminar in itself, and I'm not going to do it justice, so I am just going to give you the highlights. So there are a couple of key theorists in this field, writers in this field who've been very influential, Paulo Freire and Giraud, for example, who are really influential in raising our awareness of the idea of critical pedagogy, the idea of democratic teaching methods that challenge the oppression of learners, but also in our context, challenge the oppression of disabled people. And there's two components there's much to say about critical pedagogy, but in this talk, I just want to focus on two components that I think are really important. Supporting students to develop the skills they need to contribute to shaping a fair and inclusive society. And secondly, helping students develop critical awareness of power structures and inequities that affect whether and how people with disabilities can access and use computers and technologies. And in the next slides, I'm going to take you through both of those in a bit more detail. So first of all, if we think about supporting students to develop skills that can contribute to shaping a fairer and more inclusive society, a key aspect of that is being aware, if you like, of disability, and particularly disabled culture, disability cultures. And across a number of disability groups, embedded in their culture is the slogan and the principles and the ideas and the practice of nothing about us without us. People with learning disabilities know that phrase and they know what it means. People with other disabilities know what that phrase means. It means if you're going to research on disability, if you're going to design technologies focused on people with disabilities, then hey, involve us. So in the context of accessibility and technology, for me, that means that we need to help our students develop awareness of methods that involve people with disabilities in design of software and associated technologies. And there are a number of methods. I've listed a few of the key ones here: participatory or co-design, human-centered design, user-centered design. Often people use hybrids of two or more of those. And I'm sure there are others, maker spaces and equivalents, etc. But all of them in some way or other claim to be user-centered, involving people with disabilities. So let's think that through a bit more in the next slides. Why do we need to develop awareness of these methods for involving people with disabilities? And the different methods, not just there's one method, that there's a range of methods. I feel really passionate about this, and I've written a lot about it, because when I review design studies that report methods that have been used with disabled people, I have observed and documented inaccuracies that drive me bonkers when the authors, the academics, the researchers call a method one thing when it's clearly another. They don't seem to understand. When they falsely claim the originality of an application because they haven't read anything older than 5 years old. But also superficial engagement, where they just tell you, I've used a human-centered design, and they move on. They don't tell you, they don't acknowledge that other methods exist. They don't tell you why they chose one approach over another, and they don't provide any detailed evidence for claiming that it was a success at the end of their project. But also, as a researcher myself, I've worked in an interdisciplinary design team that involved museum educators, technology companies, people with learning disabilities, and people with visual and hearing impairments. And when we all started, all 4 of those stakeholder groups said, yeah, we're going to use participatory design and we know what it means. When we started the project, we all fell out, basically, because we were all operationalizing it very differently. And it caused huge upset, and it took a long time to all get on the same page, because we all thought we knew what we were talking about when we said, yeah, participatory design. That needs unpacking. Students need to be aware of that. So my argument is that when we're teaching students, they need to know all of those different methods. They need to know how they're defined, what the similarities and differences are. They need to know the history, the origins, applications, examples, how they might be adapted, who the champions of the methods are. And lots of stuff I probably haven't thought about in that slide, but you get the message. So let's move on, Sarah, to the next slide. How do we help students develop critical awareness of the power structures and equities, that second component of critical pedagogy that I introduced you to? How some disability groups are privileged over others. I think that's really important that our students are helped to become aware of that. It's not uncommon in my field, for example, for some designers to say, people with learning disabilities don't have the capacity. They couldn't possibly work alongside me as an academic. They don't have the skills or the capacity. Rubbish, but that's, okay. But we also need to be challenging and thinking about how some non-disabled stakeholders are given the power to influence the design of a technology without considering positionality or biasness of their views, if you like, just assuming that all caregivers, all stakeholders are working in the best interest of the disabled person, and that needs checking. So if we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to quickly give you an example. I was reviewing an HCI paper that I've been asked to review for a journal. Actually, it was quite a good paper. I recommended acceptance subject to amendments, but there were two bits that I was not happy with. Two quotes I want to share with you. First quote: after the interviews, post-interview meetings were held with the caregiver psychologist to verify the accuracy of the information collected from the interviews. And this was a study, sorry, I haven't explained, designing technology for people with very mild learning disabilities. So why is it appropriate to give caregivers a voice in this context? Will all caregivers give an accurate or unbiased picture of the lives of people they support? And whose voice do you privilege if the caregiver and the disabled person's account differs? Our students need help figuring that out. It needs problematizing. Second phrase, perhaps I pulled my hair out even more. There was this kind of sentence: caregivers, despite recognising the challenges individuals face, are open to granting them more freedom and autonomy, provided they have the means to monitor or support them remotely. Positioning the caregivers as having the power to grant freedom and was suddenly open to granting people with learning disabilities more freedom. What a phrase. That needs challenging. It's not a neutral statement. But designers, when they're writing up their HCI projects, often use that kind of language, and it needs challenging. It needs awareness raising. Rant over. Next slide, Sarah. But how? So I've introduced you to the problems. I've introduced you to the idea of critical pedagogy. How do we operationalise that? Two key ways. The first key way, I think, is experiential learning. We need to be giving our students opportunities to experience working with people with learning disabilities and other disabilities. And I just come up with 3 examples. I'm sure you can think of more. One example might be to set up panels of disabled technology users who are willing to engage with our students in a range of design experiences. And my inspiration is Dundee University and Annalou Waller, who's a disabled computer scientist herself, who runs these user panels. And she uses those for a range of things, including students presenting their AT dissertation ideas to the disabled user panel for feedback before the students go ahead and start their projects. But there could be variations on this. We could involve the panels in proposing new technologies that they'd like to see students have a go at designing in their projects. We could involve panels in producing user personas that then can be used in student assignments or design exercises. Second example is organising internships with assistive technology and other kinds of technology companies who have a good track record in designing with and for disabled people. And thirdly, inviting disabled and also non-disabled programmers who've got a good track record in this field to come and talk to our students about how they've worked with disabled people in their own projects. And finally, the last 2 slides in the yes but how is scaffolding. So in classroom discussions, we need to scaffold those conversations with students that challenge ableist assumptions, create teachable moments so that when a student in a design project type assessment type context says something that's ableist or has a kind of ableist assumption, that we kind of can challenge that gently. Is there another way of looking at this? It sounds like you think this, how about this? And I think there's a role, I know in pure STEM subjects, seminars maybe not a common approach, but seminars, workshops are equivalent, where our design students are encouraged to critique and discuss design papers, design projects, and we as educators are building in those reflective, evaluative elements into them, where we're encouraging those critique of challenges and issues. And the final slide, Sarah, you were pleased, I know I'm running into Q&A. So just to give you 4 example scaffolding questions, what justifications is the paper you're reading or the project we're learning about? What have they given for the choice of their design project? Have their approaches been adapted in any way to make them more accessible for users with disabilities? What evaluative evidence are the project leaders giving you to show that this has indeed been inclusive and participatory and successful as claimed? What challenges were there in the real world? Let's not just kind of whitewash this and say, oh, we were successful, it was brilliant, but are these designers acknowledging the challenges and giving us some insight into what they've learned that they would take forward in the next project in terms of mitigating those challenges? So I think that's my last slide. I think the next slide is just opening up for any questions. So sorry for going 2 minutes over, Sarah, but we'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. There's so much for us to think about in that presentation. I'd be delighted, everybody, if you would like to put forward any Q&A for Jane. At the moment, the Q&A is quiet. Maybe people are just waking up after lunch, but please do bring your questions forward. I have a question which is about well, there are so many questions, Jane. I do apologise, because I know sort of ahead of this, I was thinking, when you're working with people with disabilities and community groups and so forth, there's a question about how you get started with that, which might be one question. But of course, as you were talking, I was thinking other things. And one of the things I would like to ask, if I may, is I'm aware sometimes I have disabled students who want to launch projects that are sometimes from within still quite medical or the neoliberal frame of, if you like, interventions that will negate a disability or fix someone, maybe with a disability that they hold themselves. Do you have any thoughts on, does this approach need sensitising when we're working with disabled students, or is this part and parcel of what we do and taking everybody on that journey together?
That's a big question, Sarah. Let's try and unpack that. So, in a sense, I think embedded in your question is, to what extent do we try and intervene in our scaffolding and whatever else, our experiential learning opportunities, to prevent that kind of student starting off on a journey that we think is not going to be the most successful or helpful, or do we let them learn by experience that they're going to get knocked back with a lot of criticism? It's difficult because it is such a sensitive and political area, but I think before students start coming up with their ideas, I think we have a responsibility to be helping them make informed decisions. And then if they decide that they still want to carry on down that route, and there is a case sometimes for technologies as interventions for particular health needs and so on. But if they want to go down that route, be able to go down that route with a wider awareness of how others might perceive that, and therefore what that means for recruitment, etc., etc. I think it would be. I think I'd feel uncomfortable just, letting a student start off on a journey that I thought, oh, they're just going to get hammered to pieces, and then we'll learn from it afterwards, if that makes sense. I hope I've answered your question, but it is an interesting one. But it's also a very political area. So, for example, I know I've mixed my labels. Sometimes I talked about disabled people in this talk. Sometimes I've talked about people with disabilities. And I know that might mean some people now hate me and some people now love me because of the labels wars. There is a sense where part of what we're helping students deal with is that there will never be 100% consensus. And they need to be aware of that when they're entering the design field. But our biggest job is to help them be aware that their view of the world is not the only view of the world.
Thank you. Questions are now flooding in, of course. So the first one I have is from Faustina Huang, who says, to help mitigate inaccuracies with referring to methods by the wrong name or confusing methods, are there particular resources you would point people to? Thank you for such a thought-provoking talk.
Well, at the risk of being really narcissistic, when we share my slides with you, the last slide has got a couple of references of a couple of things that I've written where I've reviewed the design field, and so that might be a good starting point. But I think the biggest advice I can give is to be encouraging our students to be looking back into literature that's from the 70s, 80s, 90s. There is a whole history of stuff. But I think maybe starting off looking at the references that I reference in my two papers, because I'm referencing some key things there, that might be the best. Sorry, that was a very narcissistic answer, but it's the best, quickest I can give.
So we've got a couple more questions. Mike, who I suspect may be Mike Wold at Southampton, asks about students accessing disabled people's sharing of experiences on social media. To what extent can we send students looking for, if you like, the experiences of disabled students? Do you want to respond on that? Because I think that's one where I have thoughts. I'm sure you do.
Well, full disclosure, I have withdrawn from Twitter, because I think it is an unsafe place. And I have a Facebook, but it's closed only to my family and friends for similar reasons. So the only social media I'm on is LinkedIn at the moment, because I just think the world is a very unsafe place. And I think particularly in the context of disability and in the context of what's happening around the world, it's getting unsafer. So it might not be the answer Mike was expecting, but I'm not sure social media would be the first place I send students to if they are going to interact in a visible way, and particularly if they're going to identify themselves with a particular label and they don't know how that invisible Twitter space is going to react to them. Maybe people have got different experiences, but there are probably safe online spaces, and I think as lecturers we probably need to do our homework about where we point students to. But I think a carte blanche, just go and tweet about it, is probably in this day and age not the right thing to do.
Thank you. I agree. It's such a fast-shifting situation. It's very difficult to sustain the same kind of advice as a teacher in this field. We have 1 minute, and I'm going to squeeze one little question in. Sarah Horton asks, is there any value in sharing examples of disability dongles with learners? That is, that disability aid that's meant to solve a real or perceived problem for disabled people, but which was built without including disabled people in the design process. So sometimes these are notorious. Is it worth critiquing those tools as well as the papers about the tools?
Absolutely. I think it's worth, having a show and tell of everything that we think it can provoke and promote discussion. So I'm not sure I could point to a gold standard thing that I would show students, but I would absolutely value a session where we all brought something along and said, look, let's have a chat about this, and what are the pros and cons in terms of what it's achieved, but also how it was achieved. I'm sure there are some great things that have been designed without involving disabled people, but doesn't mean that we shouldn't have the conversations about that process and all the pros and cons that go with it. Thank you for that question, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Jane, for joining with us today and for sharing your presentation. It's been so interesting, and I know everybody will be appreciative of that.